Come closer. You've been feeling it too, haven't you? That subtle shift in the air, a whisper of something wrong, a cold dread that isn't just in your mind, but in the very fabric of the world around you. We're talking about a horror that doesn't just stalk the shadows. It is the shadows. It devours light, color, and eventually everything you hold dear. Before we delve into this nightmare, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Join us in the shadows, never miss a nightmare, because what you're about to hear, well, it might just change the way you see the world forever. It certainly changed Elias Thorne's. Elias Thorne was a man who lived for color. His studio, nestled in the ancient city of Veridian, was a sanctuary of vibrant hues. He painted landscapes that burst with life, portraits that glowed. But lately, a subtle dullness had begun to creep into his perception. The world seemed less. He dismissed it, of course, attributed it to long hours, tired eyes, the natural ebb and flow of creative vision. Just overwork, he'd murmur, wiping his eyes, trying to clear the phantom film that seemed to cling to everything. But it wasn't just his eyes. Sometimes a shadow would catch his attention. Not just any shadow, but one that seemed too deep, too absolute, pooling in a corner with an unnerving density that defied the natural fall of light. He was nearing completion on a commissioned portrait, a vibrant piece for the city's mayor. Every brushstroke was a testament to Veridian's famed light, a symphony of reds, golds, and emeralds that sang on the canvas. He left it to dry overnight, confident in his work. But the next morning, a cold dread seized him. The vibrant hues of the portrait had died. Sections of it were muted, almost monochrome, as if the color had simply evaporated. He tried to reapply the pigment, but it wouldn't take. It was like painting on a void, the colors simply sinking in, vanishing without a trace. A cold, creeping fear began to settle in his bones. This wasn't a mistake. This was unnatural. The unease grew. His studio, once his sanctuary, now felt like a mausoleum of fading light. The air grew thick, and the silence seemed to hum with an unheard frequency. He felt watched, though he knew he was alone. Then came the shadows. One afternoon, as he crossed his studio, his own shadow seemed to stretch, impossibly long and thin, like a predatory limb reaching out. It was a fleeting moment, a trick of the light, he told himself. He spun around, heart hammering. His shadow was normal, clinging to his feet as it should. Just his mind playing tricks. But the image of that elongated, grasping darkness lingered, a cold knot in his stomach. He began to notice it elsewhere. The shadows in the city seemed to cling a little too heavily, to absorb too much light. The vibrant hues of Veridian, once its hallmark, seemed to be subtly draining away day by day. His art became a desperate act of defiance. He painted with a frantic urgency, trying to capture the vanishing hues of the world, to preserve the beauty and color before they were swallowed by whatever this was. The city itself seemed to be holding its breath. The laughter on the streets grew quieter, the vibrant market stalls seemed less inviting. A pervasive dullness had settled, a visual silence that pressed in on him. He remembered old tales, whispers of the Chromatic Maw, an ancient entity that devoured the spectrum of light. He'd always dismissed them as folklore. Now, a chill ran down his spine. Was this it? His obsession grew. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Every waking moment was spent at the easel, battling the encroaching monochrome, his brushes flying, his eyes burning. Then he saw it. On the corner of his favorite landscape painting, a piece that depicted a meadow bathed in golden light, a small, perfectly black void had appeared. No bigger than a coin, yet impassably deep. He stared transfixed. It wasn't a smudge. It wasn't paint. He reached out, his hand trembling to wipe it away. His fingers hovered, an icy coldness radiating from the spot. As he watched, horrified, the void began to grow. Slowly, inexorably, it absorbed the pigment around it. The vibrant greens and yellows of the meadow seemed to melt, to be sucked into that absolute blackness, vanishing without a trace. This wasn't an artistic defect. This was consumption, a literal devouring of light and color. Elias felt a primal terror grip him. This was not a void in his painting. It was a void eating his painting. It was not merely dark. It was an absence of light, of form, of being. It was a hole in reality itself, manifest on his canvas, and it was growing. His masterpiece, a testament to light and beauty, was becoming a canvas of nothingness. The chromatic maw, the ancient horror he'd dismissed, was here, and it was hungry. A new, terrifying symptom began. His own vision seemed to darken, to blur at the edges. Colors, once so vivid, now appeared muted, washed out. Was it his eyes, or was the world itself fading? The line between physical blindness and existential erasure blurred. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to force the colors back, to clear the encroaching darkness from his sight. But it was no use. He looked back at the painting, the void now a gaping maw. Then he looked down at his own shadow, stretching unnaturally long across the floor, reaching towards the canvas. And in that moment, he realized the void wasn't just on the painting. It was in him. It was everywhere, and it was coming for the light. The last image of the growing void on his canvas and his own unnaturally stretching shadow burned into Elias's mind. Sleep was a forgotten luxury. He stood transfixed, the chill radiating from the canvas now a palpable presence in his studio. It wasn't just a hole in a painting, it was a gaping wound in reality itself, and it was alive. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure that seemed to steal the very breath from his lungs. Days bled into nights, marked only by the escalating visual decay. Elias's own vision, once so sharp, now felt like looking through smudged glass. Colors, once vibrant symphonies, were now muted whispers, fading into a dreary monochrome. Was it his eyes failing, or was the world itself succumbing to this insidious blight? The lines between what was real and what was perceived blurred into a terrifying uncertainty. The void on his golden meadow landscape had devoured a significant portion of the canvas. It wasn't a static stain. It pulsated with a silent, hungry energy. The golden light, the vibrant greens, were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to drink in all surrounding illumination, leaving only a malevolent, absolute blackness. It was a wound that refused to heal, only to fester and grow. In a desperate, futile attempt, Elias picked up his brush, loading it with the brightest yellow he possessed. He tried to paint over the edge of the void, to reclaim even a sliver of the lost light. But the moment the bristles touched the blackness, the pigment vanished. Not blended, not covered, but gone asterisk. As if the void itself had swallowed the paint, leaving no trace, no residue. It was a hunger that could not be sated. He pulled the golden meadow from its easel, placing it face down on the floor. But then his eyes fell upon the canvas next to it, a still life of brightly colored fruits. A small, irregular patch of dull, lifeless gray had appeared on its edge, creeping inward like a disease. It wasn't the absolute black of the void, not yet, but it was the precursor. The horror was spreading. This wasn't localized. This wasn't isolated. The malevolent consumption was not contained by the canvas or the frame or even the air between his artworks. It was a contagion, seeping from one piece to the next, like an invisible ink bleeding through paper, slowly, inexorably devouring the very essence of color and light. Elias felt a cold hand grip his heart. His studio, his sanctuary, was becoming a graveyard of light. One afternoon, as a sliver of weak sunlight pierced the studio window, Elias saw it. His own shadow, cast by his arm as he reached for a paint tube, seemed to ripple, to detach from his form for a fleeting second. It stretched, elongated, then snapped back, adhering to him as if nothing had happened. A trick of the light, he told himself, but his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He knew it wasn't. He rubbed his eyes, convinced he was hallucinating from lack of sleep, from the constant strain of watching the world fade. Just tired, he mumbled, just a trick of the light. But the image of that wavering, independent shadow lingered, an icy tendril of dread coiling in his stomach. It felt less like a hallucination and more like a premonition. Desperate for a change of scene, for any hint of the vibrant Veridian he once knew, Elias ventured outside. But the city offered no solace. The bustling market square was quieter, the laughter subdued. The once vibrant banners and awnings seemed faded, their colors leached away, as if bleached by an invisible sun. The air itself felt heavier, denser, muffling sound and dulling vision. Then he saw it, a woman walking past a sun-drenched archway. As she passed, her shadow, cast long before her, detached completely from her form. It slithered forward, a distinct Inkai entity, then just as quickly flowed back, rejoining her feet as if it had never left. Her expression was blank, oblivious. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't a trick of his eyes. This was real. He felt a hysterical laugh bubble up, quickly stifled. Was he going mad? Was this the onset of a profound psychosis? But the evidence was undeniable. His canvases were bleeding darkness. The city was losing its color, and shadows, the very absence of light, were gaining a terrifying, independent will. He was witnessing the unraveling of reality, and he was utterly alone in his perception. He brought his easel and paints to the city's highest point, overlooking the sprawling rooftops, hoping to capture the last vestiges of Veridian's fading glory. Perhaps in the open air, away from the studio's oppressive atmosphere, the colors would hold. He chose a vista that once shimmered with life, a symphony of terracotta and azure. He squeezed a vibrant tube of crimson onto his palette, then a rich sapphire. They gleamed, alive with potential, but the moment his brush touched the canvas, applying the first stroke of crimson to a rooftop, it died. The color dulled instantly, as if sucked into a hidden sponge. The sapphire followed, turning to a flat, lifeless gray-blue. It was like painting with dust. He tried mixing, layering, applying thick impasto, then thin washes. Nothing worked. The paints, once so obedient to his will, now betrayed him, turning inert and lifeless the moment they touched the linen. It was as if an invisible, hungry entity hovered just above his canvas, devouring the very essence of light and vibrancy from every pigment he laid down. His art, his purpose, was being systematically dismantled. Back in his studio, he noticed it. The tubes of paint, once plump with color, now felt lighter. Squeezing one, only a thin, murky stream emerged, a shadow of its former self. The paints themselves were being drained, losing their very essence, even before they met the canvas. The chromatic maw wasn't just consuming the world, It was consuming the tools he used to fight it. Desperate, Elias went to his neighbor, old Mrs. Albright, a woman known for her keen eye and sharp wit. He tried to explain, to articulate the terrifying visual decay, the independent shadows. He spoke of the fading colors, the growing voids. His voice was frantic, laced with the terror he felt. Mrs. Albright listened, her eyes polite but vacant, a faint, unsettling smile on her lips. "Oh, Elias," she said, her voice a soft, placid murmur, "you artists and your dramatic flair, perhaps you need a good rest." She patted his hand, her touch cold, and gently closed the door. It wasn't dismissal, it was an absence of comprehension, a blankness that chilled him more than any scream. They didn't see it. He tried the baker, the tailor, even the young apprentice who swept the streets. Each encounter was the same: blank stares, polite nods, or a vacant, unseeing politeness. It was as if a veil had fallen over their eyes, or perhaps over their very minds. The isolation pressed in on him, a suffocating weight. He was the only one left who could see the world dying. He retreated to his studio, the only place left where the horror was undeniably manifest. The silence there was no longer comforting. It was a vast, echoing void, amplifying his own frantic heartbeat. The encroaching darkness felt less like an external threat and more like an intimate, suffocating presence pressing in on his very soul. He was truly alone, a solitary witness to the world's slow, agonizing demise. He slumped onto his stool, his gaze falling upon his beloved easel. It was an old, sturdy thing, gifted to him by his mentor, its wood worn smooth by years of use, its surface splattered with the ghosts of countless vibrant paintings. But now, on its central beam, a small, perfectly round patch of absolute blackness had appeared. It was about the size of his thumbprint, yet impassably deep, a hole in the wood. He reached out, his hand trembling. It wasn't paint, it wasn't char, it was an absence. His finger hovered, then dared to touch the edge of the blackness. An icy coldness, beyond anything physical, radiated from the spot. It felt like touching pure vacuum, a point where reality simply ceased to exist. He snatched his hand back, a gasp escaping his lips. The wood was gone, physically gone. As he watched, horrified, the void on the easel began to grow. Slowly, like an ink stain blooming on blotting paper, the blackness spread, consuming the rich, warm wood. The material didn't splinter or burn. It simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but an absolute, malevolent absence. His easel, the foundation of his art, was being devoured, piece by agonizing piece. This wasn't just an object. This was his easel, his companion, a silent witness to every landscape, every portrait he'd ever brought to life. It was a symbol of his identity, of his purpose, and now it was being erased. The Chromatic Maw wasn't content with just his paintings. It was coming for the very tools of his creation, for the essence of who he was. It was a direct, personal assault. His vision, already a muted haze, darkened further. The edges of his studio seemed to recede into an inky gloom, and the remaining colors of his world faded to indistinguishable shades of gray. He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to force the light back, to clear the encroaching blindness, but it was useless. The darkness wasn't just outside. It was seeping into his very perception, blurring the line between physical impairment and cosmic horror. He dropped his hands, gazing at the half-devoured easel, a monument to the creeping void. Then from the corner of his eye he saw it, his own shadow cast by the dim light, not stretching, not rippling, but detaching. It peeled away from his feet, a silent, inky replica of himself, and began to slither across the floor. It moved with an eerie, independent purpose, not towards the light, not towards him, but straight towards the gaping, consuming more on his easel, and as it reached the void, it flowed into it, merging, becoming one with the absolute blackness. Elias Thorne stood, utterly alone, bathed in the fading light, a man without a shadow, watching his own reflection in the abyss. What would you do when your very essence abandons you, drawn to the hungry void? The void on his easel pulsed, silent and hungry. Elias Thorne stood transfixed, a strange, profound chill radiating from the spot where his own shadow had just flowed into the abyss. He felt lighter, emptier, as if a part of his very essence had been ripped away. The silence of the studio was no longer comforting. It was a deafening roar of absence, amplifying the frantic beat of his heart. He tried to move, to shake off the suffocating dread, but a profound disorientation washed over him. His vision, already a muted haze, now had growing patches of absolute, inky blackness at the edges, like blind spots expanding. Was it a trick of his failing eyes, or was the world itself being consumed, piece by agonizing piece, from the inside out? Weeks bled into an indistinguishable gray. The city, once a vibrant tapestry of life and color, now appeared as if viewed through a perpetually smudged lens. Buildings that were once ochre and crimson were now muted, indistinguishable shades of ash. The very air felt heavy, dense, muffling sound and dulling sight. Veridian was visibly fading. The change was no longer subtle. Patches of absolute black, like holes ripped from the fabric of reality, clung to ancient stone walls. They weren't just dark, they consumed light, leaving behind a terrifying, unblemished void. It was as if the city itself was bleeding darkness, seeping into every crack and crevice, devouring the very essence of its being. These weren't merely shadows. They coalesced, shifted, and expanded with an unnerving, deliberate purpose. Elias watched, horrified, as these mobile patches of absolute black actively devoured the very color from the surfaces they touched. It was a hunger, silent and insatiable, leaving behind only an absence so profound it felt like a scream. Elias painted frantically, a desperate act of defiance against the encroaching monochrome. He tried to capture the vanishing hues, to recreate the vibrant market square from memory, the laughter, the riot of colors, the feeling of sunlight on his skin. He was racing against an unseen clock, a silent battle against oblivion. But as he reached for a brilliant crimson, the memory itself flickered. The stalls, the faces, the very essence of the scene began to desaturate in his mind's eye. It was as if the chromatic maw wasn't just consuming the world outside, but was reaching into his own mind, devouring the vivid colors of his most cherished recollections. He tried to paint the warmth of a sunset, the fiery oranges and purples that once bled across Veridian's sky, a memory he clung to with desperate urgency. But the pigments on his palette, once so vibrant, now seemed duller, lifeless. They held no promise, no spark of the light he so desperately sought to preserve. The brush touched the canvas, and the imagined sunset turned to a sickly, muddy gray. His most vivid memories were being corrupted, consumed from within his own mind, mirroring the decay outside. What happens when your own past, your own identity, becomes a void? What then remains of who you are? His art, once his solace, was now a monument to his failure. The canvases, once alive with light, now turned to voids beneath his touch, absorbing the very pigment. It was a cruel mockery, a relentless stripping away of his purpose, his very reason for being. The darkness was not just outside, it was a hungry maw within his soul. Elias ventured out again, the city a ghost of its former self. The silence was heavier, broken only by the whispers of the wind through skeletal trees, a mournful dirge for a dying world. The pervasive grayness was absolute, swallowing every hint of color, every flicker of light. He felt utterly alone, a solitary witness to the world's quiet demise. He saw a lone pedestrian ahead, hurrying head down, seemingly oblivious. As the person passed a lamppost, their shadow stretched, elongated, then lifted from the cobblestones. It didn't snap back as before. It hovered, a distinct Inkai silhouette, unnervingly separate, with a horrifying, independent purpose. Elias froze, his breath caught in his throat. The shadow, like a predatory entity, flowed up the pedestrian's leg, enveloping it in absolute blackness. It wasn't a trick of the light, not a mere visual anomaly. This was something alive, something hungry, moving with a malevolent will that chilled him to his very bones. The person stumbled, a faint cry escaping their lips. And then the leg was gone, not hidden, not obscured. Physically vanished, leaving only an impassable void where flesh and bone had been. It was an absence so profound, it defied all understanding, a gaping wound in reality itself, right there on the street. The pedestrian crumpled, not in pain, but in confusion, a blank, uncomprehending stare replacing the initial shock. The void continued its silent, inexorable consumption, creeping up their body, erasing them from existence. They didn't scream, didn't fight. They simply ceased to be, absorbed into the malevolent blackness. Elias wanted to scream, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The horror was no longer abstract, confined to his canvases. It was tangible. It was eating the world, piece by agonizing piece. And the most terrifying realization, no one else seemed to notice. He was the sole witness to this cosmic consumption. He fled back to his studio, the image burned into his mind, the chilling realization a cold knot in his stomach. The void wasn't just consuming color, it was consuming existence. What would it take next? His art, his memories, or the very fabric of his own being? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and terrifying. He stumbled inside, desperate for a moment of sanity, a glimpse of himself before the world became this nightmare. He needed to see his own face, to confirm his own reality. He looked into a small, antique mirror, its silvered surface promising a familiar reflection, a tether to the world he knew. His reflection stared back, gaunt, eyes wide with terror, a mirror image of his own despair. But then a patch of absolute blackness, like a spreading bruise, appeared on his cheek in the mirror. It was small, no bigger than a coin, but impassably deep, absorbing all light, all form, all hope. It wasn't a trick of the light. It wasn't a smudge on the glass. The blackness was consuming his mirrored face, erasing features, leaving a chilling, impassable void where his skin should be. It spread with silent, horrifying speed, devouring his jawline, his temple, his very identity. It was a wound in his own reflection. He touched his own face, then the mirror. His skin was still there, tangible, yet the reflection showed a growing absence, a patch of himself being devoured. Was this merely a symptom of his failing vision, or was the darkness already seeping into him, consuming his very form, his identity, from the inside out? The line blurred completely. The reflection pulsed, a silent, hungry beat, mirroring the void on his canvases, on the city walls. The Chromatic Maw wasn't just an external threat. It was an internal invasion, a parasitic hunger devouring his very self. He watched, helpless, as his reflection dissolved, piece by agonizing piece, into the abyss. His eyes, in the reflection, were still visible, but they were no longer his own. They were dark, vacant pools, reflecting the encroaching darkness, mirroring the cosmic horror that consumed everything. They were the last vestiges of himself, staring out from a face that was rapidly becoming an unholy void. He stared into the mirror, at the face that was no longer entirely his, at the growing void that was consuming him. What would remain when the chromatic maw had finished its meal? What would be left of Elias Thorne when the light, the color, and finally the very essence of his being was swallowed by the absolute blackness? And what if, when it was done, the reflection in the mirror wasn't gone, but was something else entirely? The reflection shimmered, then solidified. It was no longer his face, no longer human. It was a swirling vortex of absolute blackness, impossibly deep, impossibly dark. And from within that consuming void, two pinpricks of light, cold and malevolent, stared back at him, not his eyes, something else, something that had been waiting. What would you do when the void stares back and recognizes you as its next meal? The reflection in the mirror was no longer his. It pulsed, a swirling vortex of absolute blackness, impossibly deep, impossibly dark. And from within that consuming void, two pinpricks of light, cold and malevolent, stared back at him, not his eyes, something else, something that had been waiting. What would you do when the void stares back and recognizes you as its next meal? Elias Thorne stood, transfixed, his own reflection now a gaping maw, a direct portal to the horror that was consuming his world, and now, perhaps, his very soul. The city of Veridian was no longer merely fading, it was actively collapsing into a monochrome ghost town. Large sections, once bustling squares or vibrant markets, were now total black voids. These weren't just dark areas, they were absences, holes ripped from the fabric of reality, pulsing with an unnatural malevolence, where light, sound, and life were utterly absent. The silence was so profound it screamed. Elias stumbled through the streets, his vision blurring further, the world a canvas of indistinguishable grays. The air itself felt like a heavy shroud, muffling every sound, dulling every sensation. Each step was a plunge deeper into a sensory deprivation chamber, a world being systematically unmade around him. He felt the insidious pressure of the void, not just on his eyes, but on his very perception of reality. The voids were no longer static. They shifted, expanded, and coalesced. He watched, horrified, as a patch of absolute blackness on a cobblestone street seemed to ripple, expanding to consume a discarded leaf, then a small puddle. The leaf didn't decay or burn, it simply vanished, absorbed into the unyielding blackness, leaving no trace. It was a hunger that left no crumbs. Desperate for answers, Elias retreated to the city's crumbling archive, a place once filled with the warmth of aged paper and forgotten stories. He sifted through dusty tomes, ancient scrolls, anything that might hint at this all-consuming horror. His fingers, now less sensitive, brushed against brittle pages, their colors long since leached away. Then, in a forgotten corner, he found it. Fragmented, half-consumed by creeping patches of blackness, were ancient texts and city folklore describing something called the Chromatic Maw. The words were barely legible, the ink fading into the parchment itself, but the chilling implications were clear. The text spoke of an elder entity, not merely a phenomenon, but a conscious, predatory being. It was described as the ultimate hunger, a cosmic void given form. It didn't just devour light and color, it devoured memory, identity, and the very concept of being. Elias felt a cold hand grip his heart. This was no localized blight. This was something ancient, something cosmic, something truly malevolent. The horror wasn't just visual, it was existential. The chromatic maw wasn't just erasing the world's beauty, it was erasing its history, its meaning, its very right to exist. What was a city without its memories? What was a person without their past? Elias felt the weight of this realization pressing down on him, a cosmic dread that dwarfed all previous fears. One passage, barely decipherable, spoke of the gaze of the maw, a silent, insidious observation that preceded its full consumption. It was said to blur the lines between reality and nightmare, to erode the mind before devouring the body. Elias felt a chill deeper than any physical cold. Had he been under its gaze all along? He pressed his palms to his eyes, trying to force back the encroaching blackness, both external and internal. The memories of vibrant hues, of laughter, of faces he once knew, flickered, desaturated, then vanished from his mind's eye. The maw was not just consuming the world, it was consuming his very consciousness, blurring the line between physical blindness and cognitive collapse. Driven by a desperate, fading hope, Elias ventured back into the city, seeking any sign of others who might still perceive the horror. He needed to confirm his own sanity, to find another witness. The streets were eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness that felt more like a grave than a city. He saw a woman standing motionless by a fountain, now a dry, crumbling monument of gray stone. He called out to her, his voice hoarse, a desperate plea for recognition. She turned slowly, her movements stiff, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. Her eyes, once bright and lively, were now vacant, dull pools of gray reflecting nothing. There was no spark of recognition, no flicker of emotion. It was as if the light within them had been extinguished, leaving only an empty shell. Her mouth moved, but no sound emerged, only a whisper of air. He tried to speak to her, to ask if she saw the fading colors, the growing voids. He reached out, his hand trembling to touch her shoulder. His fingers passed through the air near her, but he hesitated, an instinctual dread holding him back. Her presence felt hollow, insubstantial, like a faint echo of a person. She was a husk. Her memories, her identity, her very self had been consumed, leaving behind only a hollowed-out form. She was a ghost in broad daylight, a chilling testament to the maw's true horror. This wasn't just physical decay, it was the erasure of the soul. Elias stumbled back, the realization a crushing blow. He tried to call out to others, to passers-by, but they were all the same. Their eyes were vacant, their movements listless, their faces blank. They moved through the dissolving city like somnambulists, oblivious to the horror, because the horror had already consumed them from within. Elias was truly, terrifyingly alone, the last conscious witness. The city was a tomb, its inhabitants walking dead, their identities devoured. The maw was not just spreading, it was deepening its hold, hollowing out everything it touched. Elias felt a profound, suffocating isolation. What was the point of fighting if there was no one left to save, no one left to even understand? Back in his studio, the silence was no longer merely oppressive. It was the silence of a universe unmaking itself. He sank to the floor, surrounded by canvases that were now absolute voids, monuments to his futile struggle. Only one unopened tube of vibrant yellow paint remained, a last, desperate spark of defiance. A flicker of an idea, a desperate, irrational hope. He would paint light, not a memory, not a landscape, but the essence of light itself, pure, untainted. He squeezed the last of the vibrant yellow onto his palette, its color a shocking beacon against the pervasive gray. His hand trembled as he loaded the brush. He placed a fresh, untouched canvas on his easel. It was stark white, a defiant beacon in the encroaching gloom. He took a deep, shuddering breath and brought the brush to the canvas, a single, pure stroke of vibrant yellow. For a fleeting second, it glowed, brilliant and alive. But then the yellow pulsed, not with light, but with a silent, hungry beat. The pigment didn't just fade, it ripped. The canvas itself tore open, not into a mere hole, but a swirling, conscious vortex of the maw. The absolute blackness expanded from the point of contact, tendrils of void reaching out like grasping claws. The maw was here, manifest on his canvas, no longer a distant threat, but a direct physical presence. It pulsed, a silent, ravenous maw, and from its depths, a profound coldness radiated, pulling at the air, pulling at the very light in the room. Elias stumbled back, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He felt a sickening pull, not on his body, but on his mind. It was subtle at first, then insistent, like an invisible current dragging him into the abyss. Memories, vivid and precious, began to flicker at the edges of his consciousness, then were violently ripped away. The maw was consuming his thoughts, his past, his very identity, pulling them into its swirling depths. His last memories of color, of sunlight on a meadow, of his mother's smile, of the vibrant Veridian he once knew, were being torn from him agonizingly one by one. He fought, clawing at his own temples, trying to hold onto the fleeting images, but the pull was relentless, insatiable. It was devouring his mind, leaving behind only a void. He stared at the canvas, now a gaping, conscious maw, its swirling blackness reflecting the void growing within him. His mind fractured, memories dissolving into nothingness. What would be left when the chromatic maw had finished its meal? What would remain of Elias Thorne when his mind, his identity, and his last precious memories of color were swallowed by the absolute blackness? And as the void on the canvas pulsed, drawing him closer, he felt a chilling certainty. It would not be silence. It would be an echoing, eternal hunger. What would you do when the very light of your mind is being consumed, and you know there is nothing left to remember? The void in the mirror had swallowed his reflection, leaving behind a hungry, alien gaze. Elias Thorne stumbled back from it, his mind reeling, but the true terror wasn't just in what he saw, but in what he didn't asterisk. His vision, once a sanctuary of color, was now a swirling, consuming blackness, punctuated only by phantom flashes of hues that were no longer real. The world was gone. His world was gone. What would you do when the very light of your mind is being consumed, and you know there is nothing left to remember? He tried to navigate the dissolving city, but every step was a terrifying plunge into the unknown. The familiar cobblestones, the sturdy walls of buildings, now felt like shifting dust beneath his feet. His world had been reduced to a terrifying, formless void, a monochrome abyss where even the most basic landmarks had ceased to exist. Was this physical blindness, or the ultimate erasure of reality itself? He moved by touch, his hands outstretched, tracing the fading contours of what were once solid structures. But even this sense betrayed him. The stone of a wall would suddenly give way to nothingness, the rough texture dissolving into an impossibly smooth void beneath his fingers. It was as if the very atoms of the city were unmaking themselves, leaving behind an absence that swallowed all sensation. Sound, too, was a cruel torment. The city's usual symphony of distant chatter and rustling leaves was replaced by a profound, unnatural silence. Then, distorted echoes would ripple through the air, a fragmented scream, the faint clang of metal, The whisper of a name sounds that didn't belong, blurring the line between physical sound and the terrifying whispers of a collapsing mind. What would you hear if your world was being erased? And then the shadows. They were no longer mere absences of light. They were entities. He could sense them, even if he couldn't fully see them, like a cold pressure in the air, a movement just beyond his failing sight. These were the Chromatic Maw's weaponized children, detached from their sources, moving with a chilling, predatory intent. He heard a faint cry, a strangled gasp from somewhere ahead, a dragging sound, wet and sickening. He strained his failing eyes, and through the swirling blackness he saw it. A detached shadow, impassably deep, flowing over a remaining survivor, enveloping them. They didn't scream for long. There was no struggle, only silence and then absence. The shadows were hunting. They moved with a chilling efficiency, flowing over the last remnants of the city's inhabitants, drawing them into the expanding voids with a silent, horrifying grace. Elias felt a primal dread, deeper than any physical fear. He was not just witnessing the end, he was witnessing the Maw's harvest, and he was next. His world had become a tactile nightmare. Every surface was a gamble. Would it be solid, or would his hand plunge into an absolute void, a cold nothingness where reality ceased to exist? The very ground beneath him felt precarious, as if the city itself was a crumbling illusion, slowly dissolving beneath his feet. His hearing, once sharp, was now a cacophony of distorted echoes and the relentless, hungry hum of the Maw. Sometimes he thought he heard whispers, faint and insidious, just beyond the threshold of understanding. Were they the dying thoughts of the consumed, or the Maw's own alien consciousness, beginning its insidious invasion of his mind? He stumbled back into what he hoped was his studio, navigating by agonizing memory and touch. The air was thick, heavy with the Maw's presence. He reached out, expecting to feel the familiar texture of his canvases, his life's work. What he felt instead was a smooth, cold absence. Nothing. His most cherished creations, his vibrant landscapes and glowing portraits were gone. Not stolen, not destroyed in any conventional sense. They had simply vanished. Or worse, when his trembling fingers brushed against the frames, he found canvases that were now nothing but featureless, absolute black voids, absorbing all light, all memory, all hope. The canvases, once testaments to life and color, were now monuments to the Maw's absolute consumption. They were not merely black paint, they were holes in reality, wounds that bled nothingness. His artistic legacy, his desperate attempt to preserve beauty, had been erased, marked, turned into the very essence of the horror he fought. The Maw's oppressive presence was absolute now, not just an external force, but a suffocating shroud that pressed in on his very being. He felt its alien consciousness, vast and ancient, beginning its final, insidious invasion. It wasn't a voice, not a sound, but a cold, relentless pressure, a thought that was not his own, seeping into the fractured landscape of his mind. It was showing him things, glimpses, not images but concepts, the ultimate void, a place where nothing, not even thought, could exist. It was beyond darkness, beyond silence. It was the absolute absence of being, the negation of all reality, and it was being forced into his consciousness, tearing at the last vestiges of his sanity. He was cornered. In the oppressive gloom of his studio, a massive manifestation of the Maw had coalesced, rising from the floor like a silent, hungry leviathan. It pulsed, a blackness so profound it seemed to absorb the very air around him, pulling at him, not with physical force, but with an irresistible, existential dread. The pressure in his mind intensified. It was the Moor's gaze, but not just on his eyes. It was a gaze directly into his soul, dissecting him, stripping away every layer of his being. He felt his memories, his identity, his very sense of self being systematically unmade, dissolved into the invading void. He tried to fight back, to cling to a single thought, a single memory of color. He imagined his brush, vibrant with yellow, painting sunlight, but the image fractured, turning to dust in his mind. The Moor was consuming his will, his very capacity to resist. It was relentless, inexorable. The glimpse of the ultimate void became a full immersion. It was not a place of darkness, for darkness implies light. It was the absence of all things. No space, no time, no matter. Not even the concept of nothingness, for that too would be a form of existence. It was the absolute, unthinking, unfeeling void from which nothing could ever emerge. And Elias was being pulled into it. He tried to scream, to release the terror, but his throat seized. No sound escaped. The Moor was consuming his voice, his ability to communicate, to express. He was being silenced, utterly, completely, before he was erased. This was the Moor's final gift, the understanding of true non-existence before it delivered him to it. Elias felt his own consciousness fraying, dissolving like a forgotten dream. The vibrant colors of his life, his art, his memories, were not merely gone, they had never been. The Moor was rewriting his very past, making him a void before it swallowed him whole. A cold, impassable wind, born of nothingness, swept through his dissolving studio, tearing at the last threads of his being. He felt his physical form begin to unravel, not into pain, but into a profound, chilling absence. His fingers, once so adept with a brush, felt like dissolving smoke. The ground beneath him gave way. Not a collapse, but an erasure. He was falling not through air, but through nothingness, into the ultimate void that the Moor had revealed. There was no up, no down, no sensation of movement, only the profound, terrifying realization that he was ceasing to be. His last thought, a desperate, fading spark, was of a single, vibrant yellow, the color he had fought so hard to preserve. But even that, too, was consumed, extinguished by the encroaching absolute. His mind, his identity, his very soul was becoming one with the hungry darkness. He was no longer Elias Thorne, the artist of light. He was a fading echo, a last, desperate whisper in a universe that had decided to unmake itself. The Moor had finished its meal, not just of color and light, but of memory, identity, and the very concept of existence. He was becoming the void. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sensation, no thought, no memory, only an absolute consuming void. But in that profound, eternal absence, Elias felt, or perhaps imagined, a faint, cold hum, not silence, not nothingness, but a conscious, eternal hunger, a hunger that was now, perhaps, him. What would you do when you realize the void has not just consumed you, but become you, and the hunger is now your own? The void had consumed his vision, leaving Elias Thorne adrift in an ocean of absolute blackness. Yet a phantom hum, cold and insistent, vibrated through the air, a silent testament to the Chromatic Maw's relentless presence. His memories, once vibrant tapestries, were now frayed threads, dissolving into the encroaching nullity. What do you cling to when your own mind becomes a void? He moved by instinct, guided by the ghost of touch and the echo of purpose. His studio, once a sanctuary of light, was now a tomb of absolute absence. Yet a desperate, defiant spark ignited within him, not to fight, not to escape, but to preserve, to etch a single fleeting fragment of what once was before it was all gone. His fingers, no longer precise, fumbled for his last remaining tube of paint, a brilliant, defiant yellow. It was a relic from a world that had ceased to exist, a final, precious ember against the encroaching night. Even its scent, once sharp and vivid, was now a faint whisper against the overwhelming absence. He found a blank canvas, its stark white surface a defiant beacon in the internal darkness of his mind. This would be his final stand, his last act of creation. Not to recreate the world, for that was impossible, but to capture the absence of it. To paint the void itself, or perhaps to project a last, defiant burst of inner color onto the encroaching blackness. He squeezed the tube, expecting a vivid burst, but the pigment that emerged was dull, almost gray. The maw was consuming even the paint within the tube, devouring its essence before it could even touch the canvas. It was a relentless hunger, stripping away not just the world, but the very tools of defiance. With a trembling hand, Elias applied the brush to the canvas. A single, almost imperceptible stroke of faded yellow. It was meant to be light, a defiant sun. Instead, it was a whisper, a dying breath of color against an overwhelming, hungry black. The moment the pigment touched the linen, it pulsed, not with the vibrant life he intended, but with a silent, consuming beat. The faded yellow didn't dry, it ripped. The canvas itself seemed to tear open, not into a mere hole, but a swirling, conscious vortex of the maw, absorbing the fragile color into its depths. The absolute blackness expanded from the point of contact, tendrils of void reaching out like grasping claws. This wasn't just a void on a canvas. It was the maw manifest, consuming the very fabric of the painting, and with it, Elias's last desperate act of creation. A sickening pull, not on his body, but on his very essence, dragged him closer. It was subtle at first, then insistent, like an invisible current pulling him into an abyss that was both external and internal. The maw was no longer just a phenomenon. It was a conscious, predatory entity, and it was here for him. It communicated, not with sound, but with an overwhelming, crushing concept of nullity. It was not a beast, not a monster, but an all-consuming non-existence. A malevolent negation that sought to reduce all reality, all being, to its own null state. This was the horror, not something that destroyed, but something that simply unmade. The maw's true nature was revealed. It was the absolute zero of existence, not darkness, for darkness implies light, not silence, for silence implies sound. It was the absence of all things, the negation of reality itself. And it was hungry, eternally hungry, for everything that was asterisk. Resistance was futile against something that was nothingness. How do you fight a void? How do you defy an entity that seeks to unmake the very concept of defiance? Elias felt a profound, cosmic despair wash over him, heavier than any physical weight. The consumption began, not with pain, but with a chilling absence. Elias felt his physical form begin to unravel, his fingers, once so adept with a brush, dissolving into wisps of smoke, becoming one with the encroaching blackness. It was a horrifying, drawn-out process of erasure. His senses, already dulled, now faded entirely. Sound became a distant hum, then nothing. Touch became a phantom sensation, then ceased. The world was not just dark, it was unmade. And he, Elias Thorne, was being unmade along with it. His memories, the vibrant landscapes, the faces he loved, the very essence of who he was, were being systematically erased. He fought, clawing at the dissolving fragments, trying to cling to a single spark of color, a single precious memory. But the Maw was relentless, insatiable. He tried to hold onto the image of pure yellow, the color of sunlight, of hope, the color he had fought so desperately to preserve. For a fleeting moment, it flickered in his fading consciousness, a last defiant spark against the absolute, but even that, too, was consumed. The line between physical blindness and existential erasure blurred completely. He was not just losing his sight, he was losing his being. His identity, his past, his very existence were dissolving into the Maw's absolute blackness. He felt his consciousness fraying, dissolving like a forgotten dream. The vibrant colors of his life, his art, his memories were not merely gone, they had never been. The Maw was rewriting his very past, making him a void before it swallowed him whole. And then there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sensation, no thought, no memory, only an absolute, consuming void. The universe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the final erasure. But in that profound, eternal absence, Elias felt, or perhaps imagined, a faint, cold hum, not silence, not nothingness, but a conscious, eternal hunger, a hunger that was now perhaps him. The city of Veridian, once a beacon of color and life, was now an echoing, empty Maw. Its streets, its buildings, its very history consumed without a trace. The Chromatic Maw had finished its meal, not just of color and light, but of memory, identity, and the very concept of existence. But the hunger was not sated. It never would be. The Maw was not bound by walls or cities or even dimensions. It was an insatiable cosmic force, an eternal void that sought to consume all that was, all that could ever be. And as the last vestiges of Veridian dissolved, the chilling implication lingered. The Maw's consumption continued, perhaps reaching beyond the confines of that ancient, secluded city. It was spreading, silently, inexorably, across the fabric of reality itself. The story of Elias Thorne, the artist who fought to preserve light in a world consumed by darkness, ends not with a resolution, but with an echoing, eternal hunger. He became the void, and the void continued its silent, relentless march. What would you do when you realize the void has not just consumed you, but become you, and the hunger is now your own? Look closely at the shadows around you, dear listener. Are they merely absences of light, or are they waiting for their meal?